Hey, we're going to talk today about the aims and results of Castro's domestic policies in Cuba, part one. Starting off with the economic policies that Castro uses to try to consolidate his rule. First, Cuba's economic problems. The economy lacked diversification. Essentially, the whole economy was based on the sugar industry in Cuba. American investments in Cuba had shrunk following Castro's rise. The shrinking sugar market for Cuba, their shrinking market share, and their sugar industry was underdeveloped. And many industrial managers that were running the sugar industry had fled the state following the overthrow of Batista. So Castro comes in and institutes almost immediately a number of economic reforms, starting with the Agrarian Reform Act to break up what were called the latifundias, the large landed estates that were owned by corporations or private landowners, and began to institute a process called land reform, which would break up these large estates to, quote, return the land to the people. But most of that land would be going to the state. Castro would also move to nationalize the sugar industry. Remember, to nationalize industry means the government will take those businesses over. Government subsidies will be offered to poorer Cubans to help pay lower rents. The state will also invest in infrastructure projects focused on areas of communication and housing in urban areas. And import taxes on luxury goods will be assessed, along with rationing of food to deal with the food shortages that were occurring in Cuba. But attempts to diversify the economy are largely going to be unsuccessful, as no other crops would be as profitable to Cuba as the sugar crop. And more profitable sugar yields would actually decline with some of these attempts to diversify, as you're converting farms that previously grew sugar to now growing cotton, which is going to be less valuable than the sugar crop. Industrialization of Cuba was also limited because the state lacked skilled personnel, as so many had left Cuba following the revolution. And that economic break that's going to come with the United States is going to exacerbate Cuba's economic problems, leaving them reliant on the Soviet Union for economic subsidies, though that was not enough to fund the industrialization of the Cuban state. The Soviet Union will become Cuba's largest purchaser of Cuban sugar. Now, by the time we get to 1970, most of the arable land in Cuba had been collectivized by the state, with 2/3 of the farmlands now state-owned. In 1970, the harvest of sugar became a propaganda tool for the state to demonstrate the strength of Castro's economic reforms. Think about the Great Leap Forward or the goals of five-year plans in the Soviet Union. Similar effect here. In 1970, the harvest became known as the 10 million ton harvest, where Fidel Castro and his propaganda had promised that Cuba would have this greatest harvest in the history of the state. The harvest actually fell 2 million tons below that 10 million ton goal. Skilled cane workers had been industrialized in previous years. Attempts to make it a reality had depleted the soil and damaged future yields. And so the 10 million ton harvest became a symbol of the state's economic problems and continued economic failures. Now, with regard to political reforms in Cuba, these economic problems are leading to greater opposition for Fidel Castro, and it led him to become increasingly repressive. Following the failed 10 million ton harvest, Castro would move to delegate more responsibilities to subsidiary cabinet members and government bureaucrats. This would be codified in the 1976 Cuban Constitution. This constitution was adopted in 1976, and it placed Fidel Castro, obviously, as the secretary of the Communist Party and the head of government. It proclaimed that Cuba continued to be a socialist state and that the Communist Party was the only political organization in Cuba. It would establish for local assemblies made up of members of that Communist Party. that themselves would provide delegates for the 600-member National Assembly. Note, none of this is involving free elections or anything like that. And then a council of ministers under Fidel Castro would be created out of that National Assembly. This constitution would offer some autonomy to those council ministers to act. A police force would be made a part of the military of Cuba. The legal system would be streamlined to speed up the legal process. And trade unions were actually permitted some voice in the Cuban state to voice concerns for workers' rights. Economic reforms of the 1970s would attempt to bring greater efficiency and productivity to the Cuban state. Computers would be introduced into factories and offices. Incentives would be introduced in the workplace to provide productive workers with bonuses and increased pay. Quota systems would be introduced for manufacturing production and sugar production. And material and labor in Cuba would be directed to what were the most efficient factories and most efficient localities. But the economic decline that Cuba experienced in the late 1970s again, and its continued dependence and debt to the Soviet Union, would lead to a program of austerity. Austerity is the collective word for cuts in government programs that Cuba would experience in the 1980s. Cubans were called on to make sacrifices for the national good, calls to the people to consume less so they could reduce expensive imports into Cuba. These economic cutbacks would contribute to that large flood of people storming the Peruvian embassy in 1980, ultimately leading to the Mariel boat lift of tens of thousands of people leaving Cuba for largely southern Florida. In the 1980s, Fidel Castro launched what was called the Rectification program in 1986 that would reverse some of those more relaxed policies of the 1970s, as it was seen that those were failing. Farmers markets where private farmers could sell their crops were banned. Those bonuses and the extra pay that had begun were ended. Land that was controlled by independent farmers would shrink to only 2% of all the land in Cuba. Labor unions lost more rights. The results of this: productivity falls, absenteeism rises, black markets will grow, black markets to buy goods that were illegal in Cuba and or legally imported, and living standards will worsen. This all gets even worse following the collapse of the Soviet Union, where Cuba enters a period known as the Special Period. The economy is set into a tailspin as the new Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, cuts back on economic ties with Cuba. Cuban incomes plummet. Cuban oil supply from Russia drops from 13 million tons to 2 million, leaving tremendous fuel shortages in Cuba. Power supplies to homes and factories would be cut, and strict government rationing of consumer goods began. Following this special period, Castro would again be open to some reform in the post-Soviet era. He allowed the US dollar to operate as legal currency in Cuba. He encouraged tourism, especially wealthy Americans and others, to come into Cuba. In 1994, Fidel Castro and American President Bill Clinton agreed to allow 20,000 Cubans a year to leave Cuba to the United States. And this, he hoped, would lead to Cuban emigres sending their dollars back into Cuba to help bring American money into the Cuban system. This previously was illegal, now it was permitted. He opened up improved relations with the European Union, and in the absence of the Soviet Union, he increased his economic ties to China. But there was still repression in the Cuban state politically. He was willing to make some economic reforms, but he did not ease up on his political authority, continuing to arrest political opposition. This escalated in 2003 when Fidel Castro called for the execution of Cuban dissidents who had seized a ferry in hopes to escape Cuba to the United States. This resulted in economic sanctions being put on Cuba by the European Union. Remember, the United States already has plenty of economic sanctions against Cuba, so that's not somewhere where we could add more. In 2006, with Cuba continuing to struggle economically and Castro growing weaker in his old age, he steps down from the head of government, and his brother Raul would rise to power. We'll be back in a couple days with a second look at Cuba's domestic policies.